Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, Penny and Amanda, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I'm going to share with you some of my experience working on the area of family violence in the context of multiculturalism, but more specifically in the context of collectivist culture. I'm going to explain a little bit more what the collectivist culture means and how, for example, family violence fit in this context. So usually, when we talk about family violence, we think maybe this concept is well known internationally, but the problem is that the concept of family violence is not necessarily something that different cultures will be familiar with. So the issue of family violence is always there, but then how that would be understood would be different from culture to culture. What I'm trying to do now, I'm trying to share with you what is the difference in terms of understanding family violence in a Western culture, like Canada, and the concept of family violence in a collectivist culture, like Middle Eastern culture, Asian culture, and how, for example, that would impact the responses and the solutions that many services are providing to address the issue and also to protect victims of family violence or domestic violence. So all this would be discussed and explained through a new model of prevention and intervention. I would call it, I would say, is an alternative kind of solution, alternative responses to family violence when it comes to families coming from different cultural background, non-Western cultural background, and living in Western countries. And that's the culturally integrated family violence prevention or intervention. So for me, everything is context. And context will give us different perspectives and understanding of any phenomena, including family violence. Now, family violence, as I said, is a new concept in collectivist immigrant communities. And the key challenge here in working with families coming from a collectivist background, I think the key challenge here is really how the system works in Canada, for example, when addressing family violence in any community. And the Canadian system, like many other Western systems, is working based on an individualistic model of intervention. Like really, the problem is with individuals, and the solution would be really focused on individuals, regardless of how these individuals relate to any other, let's say, groups, whether a family or a community or any other groups. So that is, on one hand, we have individualistic model of intervention. On the other hand, the way this family is functioning as a collective, which really means that many families who are coming from the Middle East or from many other cultural background, they are collectivist families. What collectivists mean, I would explain that so that to give you some context of what we are talking about now. So, before we go further and explain our model of intervention or responses, and to discuss more the challenges that many service providers are facing when they are working with families coming from collectivist background and involved with family violence, I would like to explain what is collectivist and individualistic cultures means. So collectivism is defined as any philosophic, political, economic, or social outlook that emphasizes the interdependence of every human in some collective group and the priority of group goals over individual goals. So the key here with collectivist communities or collectivist families is really the collective entity. And that's really whether the family or the community. And I mean by that simply, even when you look at the notion of self in a collectivist context, is really rooted within the collective. So meaning you as an individual in a family or in a community, you are part of a collective entity. So you are mainly role-oriented. So your position, your status is really defined by your role, whether you are a son or a daughter, a father, a mother. Whereby, for example, in an individualistic society, it's a right-oriented society. Everybody has a right. So then as an individual, as a family member of a child, so maybe you have a right. And many of the examples that we maybe that we have seen, that many immigrant children, when they come here, the first thing that they will learn, nobody can hit you, nobody can do this and this. And then when they go back to the family, they will say, you know what, Dad, you can't hit me. If you do this, I'll call 911. And that really creates a lot of tension and also a lot of miscommunication. And then everything will really change in the family. Because the family would be see themselves in this context, in the context of individualistic society, as a victim of the system. Because they think they are obligated to discipline their kids in a certain way. They are obligated to socialize their kids so that they can really play the expected roles within the family, within the community. And that really will create also some kind of conflict between these kids and, for example, the school and how, for example, the system works. So when we look at, family violence intervention or family violence services in general, I think it's important for us to look at the challenges from this framework. The conflict between the collectivist nature of families coming from collectivist background and the way the services is delivered that is really mainly focusing on individuals regardless of their ties with their families or with their community. I'm just going to skip this because, I think I explained that a little bit. But also at the same time, we need to make sure, it is important also to mention here, it's not really black and white. In any collectivist community or family, there is aspects of individualistic. At the same thing also, in any individualistic society, there is also the aspect of collectivism. And psychologically, what does that mean? We as human beings in general, we are driven by two main desires. On one hand, we want to maintain our individuality, but also at the same time, we want to maintain our emotional connections or ties with the people who we love. So that's really an internal struggle in any human being. But then maybe the emphasis would be different, the way the society functions. In an individualistic society, the base is really the individual basic human rights, which is really important. And because of that, we tend to really focus on ourselves more than others. And others would be maybe those who are really close to us, like family members, or maybe others could be anybody in the community or in the society. Within a collectivist community is different. So the focus is, and the emphasis is really more on your ties, your relationship. So then you will have a lot of support from your community, but also at the same time, the community could be a problem for you. Because if you want, for example, to have more privacy, you want, for example, to have more freedom, and then you can't, because also there will be some limitations. So then both context, both roles have their own problems. It doesn't mean, for example, like collectivist is better than individualistic and vice versa. I think we're looking in terms of balance, really how we can balance, in terms of solution, how we can balance between these two main elements that exist in with any human being, but also at the same time, have some implication on our status in any community. Now, how is that actually impacting or affecting the responses or the services available to protect, let's say, for example, victims of family violence, or to maybe respond to family violence in any collectivist immigrant family? So the reality of the relationship between mainstream services and collectivist communities or families, as I said, it's really both systems, the family system of a collectivist nature and the mainstream service are not communicating. They cannot interact. If you are coming from a collectivist background, I think maybe, personally I'm coming originally from Yemen, and I know, for example, that had works in my family, back home or also here. So the family function in a way that mainstream services who are really mandated to protect victims of violence would not be able to understand or to see or even to recognize. There are some people who are maybe vulnerable in their families and maybe could be subject to violence. And I will show you now with this chart how it works. Again, when we talk about victimization of domestic violence or family violence in the context of family, in the context of collectivist culture, we need to understand the dilemma of the victim. And I said, for example, there is identity dilemma and also individuality and collectivity. So as a victim, for example, mainly we know from statistics and also from research that the overwhelming majority of victims of family violence are women or children. So they are really the most vulnerable people in the family. So in this case, maybe they will be the victim or potential victim in any family. So, but that is the system of this. So that is the system of any collectivist family. And that will be, for example, the position of a victim. You see in the middle here. And then there are so many layers. You have the parents, spouses, siblings, extended family, community of origin, and then you have the broader community. So, as a victim here, in order to get some help from a traditional mainstream services, you can't really, have direct connection. And the problem is, if, for example, a mainstream service, let's say, for example, Children in Society, receive a report of child abuse in a collectivist community or collectivist family, and usually maybe the school will report to the Children in Society, and the child protection worker will come to school, and then maybe will try to remove the child from here. And that's really usually what's happening if you don't understand the context. So by removing this, the victim, in this case a child, the whole system would collapse. So if you don't understand the context, you are doing more harm to the victim than really providing support and help to the victim. I'm not saying that we are really undermining any kind of violence or abuse. But what I'm trying to say, context is important. We need to understand. Even, for example, when we do some good things, we need to understand the context and the lived reality of the victim and also their families. So that is just to show you how complex it is. Now, usually, you have these two pictures. As I said, on one hand, you have the service providers here. It could be, for example, police, women shelters, it could be victim services, it could be Children in Society. But on the other hand, you have this family who is functioning this way. If there is, for example, abuse here, if those two systems are not communicating well, you don't know. If you remember the case that happened in Kingston, the Shafi'a case, where a man killed his wife and I think two of his daughters. When you, for example, follow this case, you see that everybody here has done everything. Everything. The Children in Society, the police, victim services, but then tragedies happened here. Because they went here and they reported, they got the report from here, and then they analyze it in the way that makes sense to these services. So these services are working and functioning in an individualistic model, it really doesn't give them enough information about the context. So then tragedies happen even though, for example, everything has been done by this service. Now, so usually, if you look at the process of the situation like this of victimization of family violence, maybe if I go back, so that would be, I would call this phase one. You know, it could be, for example, violence here, but the system would not be aware of it. Now, maybe sometimes what would happen, for some reason, maybe there will be some kind of report. I'll just take here an example of the children in a society. Let's say, for example, we're talking about family violence or child abuse in the context of family. And you see, usually what would happen, this is really the most critical part of the process. When the report comes, let's say, to the school here, to the school, broader community, I just really put it this way, to school, and then the child will be removed and placed somewhere in between. Maybe, you know, could be with a relative, or maybe could be with, I don't know, whoever, for example, a kinship or something like that. So we see, for example, that because there is no communication, and there is no intercultural communication. We are a multicultural society, but we don't have intercultural communication. So that would actually impact the way the system would react. And most of the time, actually, the reaction would be based on stereotypes. And to be frank with you, if this child would be a girl, 14 years old girl, and she would be a Muslim or an Arab girl, most likely the system would overreact because of the stereotype. You know, because now maybe she would have some conflict with her parents because of dating, or because of wearing hijab, or because of any assumption that maybe would make them think, you know what, if we are not going to rescue this girl, she is going to be killed. So when you have this kind of assessment and assumption, it's most likely that's going to impact your intervention. So the intervention will be actually, you know, determined by the way you assess the risk, but also by the way you conceptualize the problem. So if you think, for example, that the problem is the family, meaning the problem is the community, the system, the family system or the community system of the victim. So then this system actually would react to rescue the victim from this, because you consider this all as a problem. You don't see any of these groups to be a solution or part of the solution. So imagine, for example, if somebody, for example, coming new to this country, and I know, for example, many cases that I have dealt with, they come new to the country, and then somebody would not, you know, tell you, you know what, you go to school, you want to pick up your daughter, and then they will tell you cannot take her because she is in dangers, and we have to protect her. From whom? From you. And then you're scared, and then you try to react as a father or as a mother, and then you go home, and then the child protection worker will come to you and try to investigate with you and with the other kids. And sometimes what would happen, because you know there is language barriers, or maybe there is some kind of miscommunication, so then you don't accept, you don't let this woman to, you know, come to you, the worker to come to your house. So then the worker will go and bring the police. And the police then will knock the door and then take you, arrest you, and then they will interrogate you. So, and that is really, if there is miscommunication and the assumption and stereotypical assumptions, so it's most likely that you are going to build more barriers here between the two systems that already they are not really communicating. So, and what would happen maybe in phase 3, maybe then in this case the victim would be, you know, placed in a foster parent or a strange parent, strange family. So then the justice system will be intervened, the children and society. So then all of a sudden, the victim will be taken away from their system here, from where they are comfortable with, to another area, and then surrounded by different kind of support. It's important, of course, to have this kind of support. I'm really trying here also to make sure that you don't misunderstand me. There is two different kinds of situations. There is situation where risks are really imminent. So there is no way only to respond and to really protect the victim. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking really about the beginning of the continuum. You know, most of the time, the miscommunication is not really when tragedy would happen. Not at the end of the continuum, really at the starting point. And I mean, for example, in this case, if you, for example, look at this stage, if we can maybe help those two systems communicate properly, you know, I think we can really make sure that the victim is safe, but also at the same time people are negotiating and come up with some kind of common ground that makes sure that the victim is safe, but also at the same time the family is understood and the community is understood. So that is actually most of the time would not be happening. So in this case, imagine, you know, the police would be involved. It could be a family matter, but also it could be a criminal matter. There is assault, and then there will be investigation, and then there will be crown attorney, and then there will be court. So imagine somebody who is new, he would not understand the language of the legal system, justice system, would not understand how the system works, confused, and any reaction the family, especially the father or the mother, would do would be against them, because they would be reacting and they would feel, you know, they are really victimized by the system. No matter what we tell them, they will think they are a victim. So now the actual victim, which is a child, would be neglected in this. And I think also the other problem here, when we look at the, with good intention, of course, those organizations are working towards protecting vulnerables like children and women. But sometimes, as I said, if you don't understand the context, you will create more harm than really doing good. And I say, for example, maybe you come from the mentality of rescuing the victim, not supporting or really understanding where they are, and then try to provide the what I would call culturally appropriate responses. So that is actually where we see many of service providers. I'm talking especially about mandated services, like the Children and Society, Victim Services, and the police. It needs to be some kind of, not just really to help them be more culturally sensitive. We need more than this. And I tell you now, for example, where everything starts, like really where the problem starts. I think the problem starts of miscommunication between families coming from collectivist background and mandated services. Is really, it starts with the conceptualization of the problem. I have been doing this work for many years now, working with mainstream anti-violence agencies as well as with other immigrant communities. And I found actually everybody is coming really from a good place. Everybody trying really to help. Everybody wants to make sure that, you know, people would really find enough support, especially those who are really vulnerable. And most of the time, many service providers believe or think the problem is really with barriers of accessing services. And I mean that services are important. To address barriers of services is also important, but that's not enough. So the problem is more complex than just really addressing barriers of accessing services. Why? Why is that a problem? Because if you, for example, think the problem is barriers of accessing services, so then what you are going to do, you are trying to simplify the complex problems. Because you will be overwhelmed with things that you would not understand. Maybe things that is beyond your training. beyond your cultural capacity. So then the way you can deal with the situation really by making sense of it, by understanding it the way you think it makes sense to you. And that's, for example, then you try, for example, as service providers to describe the problem as language barriers or cultural barriers. For language barriers, most of the time you will prescribe some kind of solution. Because there is language barriers, so the solution is, translators, interpreters. Don't get me wrong, that's really very important. And language barriers also really is really serious. But that's not enough. For cultural and communication misunderstanding, so the solution is, educate the community. Reach out to the community. And by doing so, say, okay, you know what, we done our work, we done our job. But that's not going to solve the problem. That is important, that's maybe the first step, but the problem is really more than this. The reason why I'm saying that, because if, for example, as service providers, you think the problem is just barriers, so that will be the solution. And by doing so, you don't think that there is any problem. But the problem with this, actually, you see the problem just really one-sided. You don't see yourself as service providers also as part of the problem. You think, okay, the problem is with the community, we are going to fix the community. We are going to fix the family. It's Canada, you have to do this. If you don't do this, there will be the consequences. You can say that, but you can say it in a different way. You can say it in a respectful manner, and then also you can say it by really going to where these people are. And then start from there. And gradually, you can grow to a place where then maybe you can have really reasonable responses. So that is really when we think it's barrier of accessing services. But if we would answer this question, what is the problem with understanding family violence in the context of collectivist communities, if we answer this question by looking at the complexity of the problem, so that maybe the outcome would be different. Which really means the first thing that you will come up with as a service providers, you see yourself also as part of the problem, not just really the community. So then you say, okay, you know what? There is a part of the community, but also there is a part of our side. We need also maybe to revise the way we deliver the service. We need maybe to revise the way we communicate with these families. So that this way, actually, we can come up with better strategies. And I think, and that is really what I'm trying to focus with you today, really understanding the complexity of family violence in collectivist communities. And that really means it's about understanding the dilemma of those who are really subjected to violence and vulnerable, if they are women or children in particular. To understand their dilemma, really to be able to put yourself in their shoes, in their system. So this way you will have a sense of, okay, what prevents this woman or children from asking for outside help? Not necessarily to access your service. This way you are going to be very close or closer to the problem and closer to the people. And victims or families will start really to see you differently. So they will change their attitude towards you. They will not see you as a threat. They will not see you as somebody who has really more power than them. Maybe they can start really looking at you as somebody who's maybe trying to help them. So, and I think in any situation like this, from my experience, there are three major areas that help us understand the complexity of family violence in the context of collectivist communities. And I say collectivist immigrant communities, whether they are Muslims or Arabs or Chinese or coming from Bangladesh or any other collectivist communities. So the first aspect is really the cultural aspects. And the second one is migratory experiences. And the third one is really to understand how religion plays a role in family issues or family relations. So now, what we are trying to do with this, we are really trying to come now to some practicalities. We change the paradigm. We need to change the way we perceive the issue of family violence in a context of newcomer families or collectivist families. Without doing this, we cannot really solve the problem properly within these communities. So what is the game changing here? Culturally integrated family safety response. So that is really our model. It's not just really for the Muslim community, it's really for many collectivist communities. Culturally integrated family safety response. What does that mean? If you see, for example, here, I am putting here family safety instead of family violence. We know we are talking about family violence, but we want really to see things positively. You know? So the goal and the aim is really to create safe environment in the family for everybody. And within the family, you need, for example, to support the family to really, identify who is actually, who is actually violating the family safety. Is the victim or the perpetrator? So you have really to change the way the family thinks and see violence, but also at the same time, the way service providers would understand family violence dynamic in this context. So with the culturally integrated family safety response also we mean we are not competing with mainstream services. We're trying to understand best practices. Really, we have wonderful services here, especially in the area of domestic violence in London or in Ontario. We try to use this best practice and help this best practice really be meaningful in a different cultural context. In our case, in a context of collectivist nature communities. So that's really what we are trying to do. We're really building some kind of path of mutual understanding that everybody understands each other, whether families and service providers, communities, service providers, within the family also, victims and potential victims understand, would be understood, and their voices also would be heard. So within the culturally integrated family safety response, what we are trying to do, we want to work in a holistic approach. Not in a... Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very good question. It's a very good question. First of all, I would like to say, from my own experience, migration is a trauma itself. When you migrate to a different place, you're actually coming from a place where you have memories, you have your comfort zone. Even if you are coming from a war zone, you know, for example, how to survive within this difficult situation. To come to an unknown place is scary. So that's the first thing. Yeah. The second thing, that would create what we call culture shock. And with culture shock, we respond to culture shock in different ways. Some of them would get scared and isolate themselves. And that's really what we are referring to. And when they isolate themselves, when the kids grow, the cultural clash will also become a family issue. So then this is when you see, for example, maybe kids would be more integrated, assimilated, but parents maybe would be more isolated based on fear. And most of the cases that children in society are dealing with in immigrant families actually because of this conflict. So the second way of responding to culture shock is assimilation. I would say maybe that's also really the other side of isolation. Some of them will say, you know what, okay, every problem I am living is because of the backward of my, country of events culture. So I don't really belong there anymore. This is really my culture. This is my, my society. And they want to be to fit 100%. And that's also impossible, because you cannot be somebody else. And the third category is really integration, which really means integration is different than assimilation. You try to situate yourself the way you feel comfortable, you understand your root, but also at the same time you are ready to give something and to take something. So then you integrate. And I think the solution is really to promote integration and not assimilation. And not really westernizing. Because some people think, you know what, they really mix between integration and assimilation. They expect, you see, that's also one of the problems that many immigrants would face. They think, they are obligated to take everything, to be 100% like any Canadian-born, person. But what I would say, integration really means a little bit different. You will be part of this society, but also at the same time, you keep some of your, heritage with you, so then you become yourself, and not just really somebody else. Yeah. I mean that's a good point, but also really that's a big issue. And I see what you are saying, but in the context of family violence, I see the integration, assimilation, and isolation really have a strong impact on domestic violence, in particular with parent-child, in the context of parent-child conflict. But also at the same time, I see things really more complex, as I said. I intend also always really to see things really from a broader perspective. For me, integration is also really an individual journey. It's not really just a community. Even within a family, every individual would have different way of really integrating within the broader community. I think for me, the bottom line is, regardless of the philosophical aspect of this, the bottom line is really there is no excuse for violence. There is no excuse really to break laws. So those are really bottom lines. You can't argue about this. Whether, for example, you are isolated or integrated or assimilated. So I think for me, when we talk about violence, in particular family violence, it's important for me to understand the framework, the mindset. And as I said at the beginning, if people think, for example, this is a family issue, and nobody has any business in my family, so then it's most likely, for example, if somebody would be victimized, they would react. They would not allow, for example, for any kind of intervention. So that's wrong. I think our role is really to help families understand, that you can't do this. But also at the same time, it's not just really about knowledge. Because sometimes you know things, but you don't have necessarily to practice it. Sometimes maybe it's illegal, it's wrong, but you will always create your own way to for example, behave in a certain way. Again, I'm trying really to look at this. This is a very big issue and concept, and we can discuss maybe after the lecture. In the context of family violence, I think what we are trying to do in terms of solution we try really to do some more work in prevention and early intervention. So our model of culturally integrated family safety response actually, as I said, changing the paradigm, has 3 steps or stages. The first stage is really early identification of family violence risk factors, early intervention, and we have done as an intervention coordinated organization response team, we call it CORE, and really which provide holistic kind of collectivist circles and support. So this is one of the tools that we are using. This tool called FAST, it helps us actually identify risk factors of family violence in early stages. So the first thing is really, maybe that's also really somehow would answer your question. We start with the universal aspect. So universal aspect means really that there is some kind of commonalities between all human beings. The dynamics are the same. So you start with this. If you are a social worker, you are trained as a social worker, so then the assumption is that you are already equipped and trained to really, respond to any kind of, social issues or, behavioral issues or some kind of conflict. So you use what you have known. Let's say, for example, you are dealing with a parent-adolescent conflict. So the dynamic is almost everywhere the same, So that you use that kind of knowledge, expertise to better understand, okay, what is going on here, But most of the time what would happen, if you deal with a person who is from a non-Western culture, maybe you need to ask more questions. So that if you stuck here, so maybe then all your assessment and intervention will be really limited to universal aspects. But people are really different. So that really means you have to push yourself a little bit and look, for example, at some other questions from unknown area. And that's really looking at the cultural aspects. Because, culture is really the base of any norms and values. If you deal with, for example, parent-child conflict, and then you don't have enough answer in your questions when you do your assessment, or maybe when you, for example, try to assist in this situation, so you go to ask questions related to cultural aspects. If not, so then you go also, you need to get some more information about the journey, the migration aspects. And by the way, from some of the research, I think mainly immigrants in general, whether they are refugee or landed immigrant, they have more common, I believe, in their migration journey than the cultural aspects and the religious aspect. So if you have immigrants from anywhere, if you ask questions related to their pre-migration journey, you will find a lot of information that will help you broaden your assessment and then help you really develop the most appropriate and effective intervention and responses. And in particular, pre-migration, because most of the services, they don't even ask questions related to anything related to these people before they come here. If you are really working in a family violence sector, so the focus is really on 2 things. Who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. So you look at you reduce these 2 people into different, very small slide kind of, aspects. Abuse and abuser. So don't get me wrong, that's really important. But then it's more than this in each of them. So you need to see you need to look at the man as a whole, including their pre-migration journey. Maybe they came from a war zone, maybe they experienced trauma, torture, maybe they come, for example, wealthy, from a very good background, and all of a sudden they come here and they experience post-migration difficulties. They don't have a job, they don't have, for example, enough income, and that would also really create a lot of challenges for them, which also then impact the family dynamic, and violence could be also somehow related to this kind of situation. So the third aspect is the religious and faith aspect. I'm not saying here the religion itself, but I'm saying, for example, as a moral reference. Like if you look at domestic violence, especially violence against women, it's mainly gender-based violence. But then every man, men, for example, who are really using abuse or violence, would justify their use of violence by something. Some of them, maybe they use religion. Some of them, they use culture. Some of them would use maybe, frustration, their social status, or whatever it is. So we're talking here about moral references. So you need to understand how people make sense of what they are doing. That doesn't mean that you are really compromising the core values. Violence is wrong, abuse is wrong. You're not really endorsing that in any way, but actually you need to understand how people make sense of that. Especially, for example, you as students, you need to think about that. In the future, when you start working, you need to broaden your perspective to understand and to differentiate between addressing the core issues, and that's really the violence, victimization, but also trying to see that in a broader context. That will really help you, do good social work or good social work practice, because it will help you better understand the complexity. I'm referring that to the complexity of the situation. So I already explained that. Do I still have time or 10 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay, fine. Okay. Okay. Sorry. So anyway, in summary, for me, everything goes back to how we conceptualize the problem, how we understand the problem, and who would be, for example, the key, groups of this problem. And based on our answer, I think our answer will determine how we assess risk and how we assess the situation, and as a result, what kind of intervention we are going to use. So if we simplify the problem by reducing it to barriers of language and culture, it's most likely we consider the community, the culture, and the religious background of this people the problem. So then your intervention will be focusing more on working with the community, try to help them change their attitude, which is good. But then maybe sometimes you will cross that and you try to change them to become you. And that is really where we don't understand, we don't see that we are prejudiced, and we are not aware about that. With good intention, we always then go further and further until maybe then we come to the point where we see ourselves discriminating against people because of their culture or religion or race and so on. So, but if we stop and think, and try really to understand the big picture, and consider this issue as a complex issue, so then we will ask good questions. If we don't know, we need to ask questions. If we really, trust your expertise, your training, but also at the same time be open to many surprises, many unknowns. So this way, actually, you will see that as a complex issue, and then you will start, trying to put more efforts on you, not on the clients, to understand and to ask good questions. And that would lead you, as I said, to see the different aspects that you don't usually see. And that is the cultural aspects, the migration aspects, as well as the role of religion. I think by doing so, that will help you contextualize family violence in collectivist context, and that will help you, first of all, to build bridges with your clients. Help you also really improve your skills by working in complex situations. You work with the victim, you work with the family, you work with the extended family, you work with the whole community, you work also then maybe with others. And sometimes, unfortunately, if you work in, for example, this kind of days where the media is very high with incidents, for example, that happen and could be maybe easily, label the whole community as a terrorist community or maybe a violent community. As a service providers in this kind of situation, maybe you will be pressured to take more, intrusive measures to address, the issues that we are dealing with. So that's, I would say, in general, what I would really I would be able to share with you. I know it's really complex. I know it's sometimes it's really difficult and hard within limited time to cover everything. But please, if you have any questions or any comments, ask me. I know, for example, we still need to talk about that. It's a good question, but really it's a big question that needs maybe another lecture. Thank you very much.